Greta Thunberg, Empath or Narcissist, Part 9. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. We continue our analysis of climate activist Greta Thunberg, who has recently moved more into political activism. And as we make an evaluation as to where she falls to be considered with regard to the baseline analysis of narcissist, narcissistic, empath, or normal, we also have to take into account her well-documented diagnoses. It is important to look at these because they will have an impact upon the way that a person behaves, but it is also important to consider them because it is sometimes the case that a narcissist may be misdiagnosed with an alternative condition, or that a narcissist uses an alternative condition as an explanation for problematic behavior. Common instances, for example, are for narcissists to claim to be bipolar, when in actual fact they are not. There are plenty of people who are genuinely diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Nevertheless, this can often be seized upon by a narcissist either by virtue of a misdiagnosis or simply that there has been no diagnosis and the narcissist lies about this, claiming that the behaviors that they engage in are as a consequence of bipolar disorder and therefore they can't help the way that they are. Narcissists will invariably use illness, injury, ill health, and particular psychological conditions as a means of eliciting sympathy, asserting control, deflecting from criticism, and blame shifting, and therefore one has to keep that in mind. Bipolar and autism are probably two of the most common instances hijacked by narcissists to pass themselves off as somebody that experiences those conditions, when in actual fact it's their narcissism at play. This can often hoodwink people. Therefore, we need to consider this as a potential factor with regard to the claimed diagnoses of Greta Thunberg. What is noteworthy is the fact that her diagnoses, of course, have never been shared by doctors. After all, they cannot do so for reasons of confidentiality. And the confirmations and admissions have come from Thunberg and her family, which could call into question their legitimacy. Nevertheless, we'll examine more about the various diagnoses as we come to make a determination as to their impact or otherwise. Thunberg has been open about her various diagnoses of Asperger's syndrome, which is a form of autism spectrum disorder, obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, and selective mutism. These conditions were identified during her childhood, and she has discussed them repeatedly and consistently in interviews, her family's book, Scenes from the Heart, which was co-authored with her parents and her sister, and also in her media appearances. Asperger's syndrome was diagnosed at around her age 11 back in 2014. It's characterized by challenges in social interaction and communication, restricted interests, and repetitive behaviors, often without significant delays in language or cognitive development. Individuals with Asperger's may exhibit intense focus on specific topics, difficulty interpreting social cues, and a preference for routines. Sensory sensitivities, for instance to noise or textures, are also common. Since 2013, Asperger's is no longer a separate diagnosis and is included under ASD, but Thunberg and her family used the term Asperger's to describe her condition, reflecting the terminology at the time of her diagnosis. She was diagnosed following a period of significant mental health struggles, including depression and selective mutism, which I'll move on to. Her parents notice her intense focus on specific interests, such as climate change, and her challenges with social interactions. In Scenes from the Heart, they describe how Greta's distress and withdrawal prompted them to seek professional help. The diagnosis was made by medical professionals in Sweden, though specific details about the diagnostic process are not publicly disclosed, as is typical for privacy reasons. Thunberg has described her autism as contributing to her deep interest in climate change, which she began researching extensively at around aged 8, which was in 2011. Her ability to hyper-focus on scientific data and facts about global warming became a hallmark of her activism. She has said, "I see the world a bit differently, from another perspective," noting that her condition allows her to concentrate on issues others might overlook. Is this magical thinking on her part, believing herself to be special, or is this simply a product of her autism? Thunberg has acknowledged difficulties with social norms and interactions which align with Asperger's traits. For example, she prefers straightforward communication and struggles with small talk, which she finds exhausting. This is evident in her blunt, unfiltered speaking style during climate protests and speeches, such as her "How Dare You" address at the UN Climate Action Summit in 2019. This blunt and direct manner can, of course, often be mistaken for haughty, dismissive behaviours which underpin an absence of emotional empathy. Thunberg has mentioned sensory issues, such as discomfort with noise or chaotic environments, which can be overwhelming. This influenced her decision to avoid air travel, not only for environmental reasons, but also because crowded airports and planes exacerbate her sensory challenges. Her literal interpretation of information, which is a common Asperger's trait, is reflected in her frustration with political inaction on climate change. She often emphasises the gap between scientific evidence and government policies, viewing promises without action as deceptive. Again, this might describe her absence of patience, which otherwise could be viewed as something that relates to an absence of emotional empathy or haughtiness. Thunberg refers to her Asperger's as a superpower in the context of her activism. Is this grandiosity or simply a genuine description? Her neurodiversity has resonated with many, particularly in the autism community, who see her as a role model for turning perceived challenges into strengths. However, she has also faced criticism and ableist remarks from detractors who misuse her diagnosis to undermine her credibility, which she has addressed by emphasising that her condition does not diminish her competence. She has embraced her diagnosis publicly, stating in No One Is Too Small to Make a Difference and on social media, in X posts, that Asperger's is not a disease, it's just a different way of thinking. She rejects the notion that it limits her, instead framing it as a strength that fuels her activism. In response to critics, such as a 2019 incident where an Australian commentator mocked her autism, Thunberg tweeted, "When haters go after your looks and differences, it means they have nothing left to go, and then you know you're winning." She was diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder around 2014. This is a mental health condition characterized by intrusive, unwanted thoughts, obsessions, and repetitive behaviors or mental acts, compulsions, performed to alleviate anxiety caused by these thoughts. She was diagnosed with OCD around aged 11 as part of the same mental health evaluation prompted by her struggles with depression and selective mutism. In Scenes from the Heart, her family describes how Greta exhibited compulsive behaviours, though specific details about her symptoms are limited to protect her privacy. Her parents also noted that her OCD was intertwined with her intense focus on climate change, which became an all-consuming concern. Thunberg's OCD likely amplified her fixation on climate change, turning her awareness of environmental crises into a source of anxiety and urgency. She is described feeling overwhelmed by the scientific evidence of global warming, which fueled her sense of responsibility to act. For example, in interviews, she mentioned lying awake at night, thinking about climate data and the lack of action. While specific compulsions are not detailed in public sources, her family has alluded to rituals or repetitive behaviours that began during her preteen years. This may have included organising information, for instance, memorising climate statistics, or adhering strictly to routines. Thunberg's commitment to a low-carbon lifestyle, such as veganism, avoiding air travel and wearing second-hand clothes, may reflect, partly, OCD-related tendencies towards rigid adherence to principles. However, she frames these choices primarily as ethical responses to the climate crisis. Thunberg has been less vocal about her OCD compared to her Asperger's, possibly because it is a more stigmatised or distressing condition. In Scenes from the Heart, she and her family discuss it as part of her broader mental health journey, emphasising that professional support helped manage its impact. She has not framed OCD as a superpower, but acknowledges it as part of her experience, focusing on how her mental health struggles informed her activism. For example, she has said that her distress over climate inaction motivated her school strikes, which began in August 2018. Selective mutism, diagnosed around aged 11 in 2014. Selective mutism is an anxiety-based disorder where individuals are unable to speak in certain social settings, despite having normal language skills. It is often associated with extreme shyness or social anxiety and can co-occur with other conditions like autism or OCD. Those with selective mutism may speak fluently in familiar settings, for instance at home, but remain silent or speak minimally in others. Her selective mutism emerged during a period of severe depression starting around aged 8 or 9, when she began withdrawing from social interactions. Her parents describe in Scenes from the Heart how Greta stopped speaking at school and to people outside her immediate family, communicating minimally or non-verbally. During her preteen years, Thunberg was unable to speak in schools or to strangers, which contributed to her social isolation. Her parents noted that she would freeze in unfamiliar environments, a common response in selective mutism. Her mutism was closely tied to her depression and anxiety about climate change. In Scenes from the Heart, Thunberg describes watching a documentary about polar bears and melting ice caps at age 8, which triggered profound distress and contributed to her withdrawal. With support from her family and professionals, Thunberg gradually regained her ability to speak in public. Her school strikes, which began at age 15, marked a significant milestone as she spoke to passers-by and later addressed global audiences such as the UN and COP conferences. Thunberg's experience with selective mutism adds depth to her activism as she overcame significant personal barriers to become a global speaker. Her ability to address world leaders despite this history underscores her determination. She's also experienced depression, which wasn't formally diagnosed but was acknowledged between 2011 and 2014. Her depression was seen as a contributing factor to her selective mutism and may have exacerbated her OCD symptoms. She became increasingly isolated, refusing to attend school regularly or interact with peers. Her parents describe her as disappearing into herself. Her refusal to eat led to significant health concerns requiring medical intervention. In a 2020 BBC interview, she mentioned that it took years to recover physically and emotionally from this period. Her conditions appear to be interconnected with overlapping symptoms and triggers. For example, her autism may have intensified her focus on climate change, which her OCD amplified into obsessive thoughts, contributing to anxiety that manifested as selective mutism and depression. And therefore, this overlapping and the interconnection may well legitimize what she states that she has been diagnosed with. A more cynical view might be to suggest that all of this behaviour is as a consequence of attention-seeking, that this may well be part of her narcissism, driving her to talk about these conditions, which may be true or may not even exist, as a means to assert control, provoke reactions, and possibly engender sympathy, which also assists in relation to the issue of control and fuel. She has been consistent with regard to these conditions, talking about them repeatedly and in a consistent fashion. It has been claimed that there are medical diagnoses to support this, but understandably those have not been disclosed. Accordingly, the presence of these conditions could well explain much of her behaviour, or might they just be simply ruses utilised by a clever narcissist that has seized upon these as a means of deflecting criticism, avoiding blame, eliciting sympathy, and presenting a particular facade, and utilising supposed fellow sufferers as a means of engendering support. Undoubtedly, you will have your views upon these various conditions that she has stated that she has been diagnosed with, as in the next part, we're going to bring all of this evidence together. We're going to look at her climate and political activism, her relationships with her family, with her friends, the way people have spoken about her, her social media interactions, her rewards, her diagnoses, to consider what is Greta Thunberg. Join me in part 10 for the conclusion.